Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The glass towers of Manhattan's financial district gleamed under the harsh October sun, their surfaces reflecting the bustling streets below where armies of suited professionals hurried between meetings that could reshape markets with a single decision. Among these monuments to capitalism stood the headquarters of Meridian Capital Group, a towering spire of steel and ambition that housed one of the most powerful investment firms on the East Coast. On the 47th floor, in a conference room designed to intimidate, Dr. Elena Vasquez sat perfectly still as accusations swirled around her like a gathering storm. The polished mahogany table stretched before her, its surface reflecting the faces of 12 board members whose expressions ranged from confusion to outright hostility. At 32, Elena possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that some people mistook for weakness, a mistake that had served her well throughout her career. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a conservative navy blazer over a white blouse, the kind of understated professional attire that helped her blend into corporate environments without drawing unwanted attention. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another mid-level employee caught in an unfortunate situation. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she held one of the highest security clearances in the federal government. Dr. Vasquez, began Harrison Blackwood, the chairman of the board, his voice carrying the weight of authority accumulated over 3 decades of corporate maneuvering. Blackwood was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair perfectly styled and a face that had been hardened by countless boardroom battles. His expensive suit was immaculate, his posture commanding, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to crushing opposition without mercy. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Blackwood continued, gesturing toward a stack of documents arranged precisely on the table before him. "Corporate espionage, theft of proprietary information, violation of fiduciary duty, these are serious charges that could result in criminal prosecution." Elena remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, silence was often more powerful than words. Let them reveal their assumptions, their biases, their ignorance of who they were really dealing with. To Blackwood's right sat Victoria Sterling, the chief financial officer, a woman whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned her both respect and fear throughout the financial industry. Sterling's auburn hair was cut in a sharp bob that framed her angular face, and her gray eyes missed nothing. She leaned forward slightly, studying Elena with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "Ms. Vasquez," Sterling said, deliberately omitting Elena's doctoral title, "we have evidence that you've been systematically accessing confidential client information, downloading proprietary trading algorithms, and photographing internal documents. The security footage is quite clear." Elena raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The truth was more complex than Sterling could possibly imagine, but explaining it would require revealing classified information that could compromise ongoing federal investigations spanning multiple continents. At the far end of the table sat Marcus Thompson, the chief operating officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had spent his career building Meridian's operational infrastructure. Thompson cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Elena," he began, using her first name in an apparent attempt at familiarity, "I've always respected your work in our compliance department. Your analysis of regulatory frameworks has been exceptional. That's why this situation is so disappointing." The word disappointing hung in the air like an accusation. Elena understood what Thompson was really saying: "You had our trust, and you betrayed it." If only he knew that her work in the compliance department had been meticulously designed to position her exactly where she needed to be to conduct one of the most complex financial investigations in federal law enforcement history. David Chen, the head of human resources, shuffled through his own stack of papers before looking up at Elena with an expression of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Elena, we want to give you an opportunity to explain yourself. If there are extenuating circumstances, if someone coerced you or if you were operating under some kind of duress, now is the time to speak up." Elena almost smiled at the irony. Chen was offering her an out, a way to claim victimhood and perhaps reduce whatever punishment they had in mind. But accepting that narrative would require her to abandon the mission she had spent 2 years carefully constructing, a mission that was on the verge of exposing the largest securities fraud scheme in modern history. "I appreciate your concern," Elena said quietly, her voice steady and professional. "However, I'm not sure I understand the nature of these accusations. Could you be more specific about what you believe I've done?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He had expected either tearful denials or angry defiance. Elena's calm request for clarification caught him off guard, and he didn't like being surprised. "Don't play games with us, Ms. Vasquez," Blackwood snapped. "We have security footage of you accessing restricted areas after hours. We have computer logs showing you downloaded files far outside your authorization level. We have testimony from multiple employees about your suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior," Elena repeated thoughtfully. "Could you elaborate on what constitutes suspicious behavior in this context?" Sterling leaned back in her chair, clearly frustrated by Elena's composed demeanor. "Asking detailed questions about client portfolios that had nothing to do with your compliance work. Requesting access to trading data from departments you had no business interfacing with. Taking photographs of confidential documents. Yes, we know about that too." Elena nodded slowly, as if processing this information for the first time. In reality, every action Sterling described had been carefully planned and executed as part of a broader federal investigation. The photographs weren't stolen corporate secrets, they were evidence of securities violations that would eventually be used in federal court. "I see," Elena said. "And you believe these actions constitute corporate espionage?" "We don't believe it," Blackwood declared. "We know it. The question is, who are you working for? Which competitor paid you to steal our proprietary information?" The assumption revealed everything Elena needed to know about how the board viewed the situation. In their minds, corporate espionage was the only possible explanation for her behavior. The idea that she might be a federal investigator working to expose their own criminal activity had never occurred to them. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about my role here at Meridian." "Your role," interrupted Sterling, "was to ensure regulatory compliance. Instead, you've been systematically violating the trust we placed in you." Elena considered her options. She could continue to deflect, buying more time for the federal task force to complete their investigation. But the board's hostility was escalating, and she sensed they were moving toward some kind of ultimatum that would force her hand. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elena asked. Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're proposing that you cooperate fully with our internal investigation. Reveal who you're working for, provide us with copies of any information you've stolen, and help us assess the damage you've caused. In return, we might be willing to handle this matter internally rather than involving law enforcement." The offer was both generous and insulting. Generous because it suggested they were willing to let her avoid criminal prosecution. Insulting because it assumed she was nothing more than a low-level corporate spy who could be bought off with leniency. Elena looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. She saw greed disguised as righteous indignation, fear masquerading as authority, and the kind of institutional arrogance that had made Meridian Capital Group such a perfect target for federal investigation. "That's an interesting proposal," Elena said. "But I'm afraid I can't accept it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood's facade of civilized discourse cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath. "Then you're making a serious mistake, Ms. Vasquez. We have enough evidence to destroy your career and send you to prison. Whatever your mysterious employer promised you, it won't be worth spending the next decade behind bars." Elena stood slowly, her movement graceful and unhurried. For the first time since the meeting began, she smiled, a small, enigmatic expression that somehow managed to fill the room with uncertainty. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I think you may have misunderstood who I work for. The confrontation in the boardroom marked the beginning of what would become the most significant securities fraud investigation in recent federal history. But to understand how Elena Vasquez found herself in that room, facing down some of the most powerful figures in American finance, we need to go back to where it all began. 18 months earlier, Dr. Elena Vasquez had been working in relative obscurity as a senior analyst for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Her office was located in a nondescript government building in Washington, D.C., surrounded by the kind of institutional beige that seemed designed to discourage creativity and independent thought. Elena had earned her Ph.D. in economics from MIT, specializing in quantitative analysis of market irregularities. Her doctoral dissertation on algorithmic trading patterns had caught the attention of several federal agencies, but she had chosen the SEC because she believed in the mission: protecting investors and maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets. For 3 years, she had analyzed trading data, investigated suspicious transactions, and written reports that rarely saw the light of day. It was important work, but it felt distant from the real-world impact she had hoped to achieve. That changed on a cold Tuesday morning in March when her supervisor, Director James Morrison, called her into his office for what he described as a special assignment. Morrison was a career bureaucrat in his 50s, the kind of man who had spent so long navigating government politics that he had developed an almost supernatural ability to say nothing while appearing to be remarkably informative. His office was spartanly furnished with standard-issue government furniture and a collection of framed certificates that testified to his various training completions and length of service awards. "Elena," Morrison began, settling behind his desk with a thick manila folder, "I have an opportunity that I think might interest you. Are you familiar with Meridian Capital Group?" Elena nodded. Meridian was one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast, managing over $200 billion in assets for institutional clients and high-net-worth individuals. They were known for consistently outperforming market benchmarks and for maintaining an air of exclusivity that kept them largely out of the public eye. "We've been receiving irregular signals in our market surveillance systems," Morrison continued. "Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger automatic flags, but patterns that suggest someone with significant resources and sophisticated algorithms is engaging in coordinated trading activities that may violate federal securities laws." Elena leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of patterns?" "Micro-timing irregularities across multiple markets. Coordinated positioning ahead of major announcements. Trading volumes that correlate with insider information in ways that are mathematically improbable without advanced knowledge." These were exactly the kind of complex financial crimes that Elena had studied in graduate school and dreamed of investigating in the real world. "And you suspect Meridian?" Morrison opened the folder and spread several charts and graphs across his desk. "We suspect Meridian is at the center of a network that includes hedge funds, foreign investment banks, and possibly government officials in multiple countries. The scope is unprecedented." Elena studied the data, her trained eye immediately picking up the anomalies Morrison had described. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable, the kind of coordinated market manipulation that could only be accomplished with advanced knowledge and massive resources. "This would require deep cover investigation," Elena observed. "Someone would have to get inside Meridian and document their operations from within." Morrison smiled. "Exactly. Which brings me to why you're here. Your background in quantitative analysis makes you perfect for a compliance role at a firm like Meridian. Your SEC experience would be seen as an asset, not a liability. And your academic credentials would give you credibility with their executive team." Elena felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. "You're talking about an undercover assignment." "I'm talking about the most important securities investigation of your career," Morrison replied. "But it would require complete commitment. You would need to resign from the SEC, at least on paper. You would need to build a convincing background as someone looking to transition from government service to the private sector. And you would need to be prepared to spend months, possibly years, gathering evidence while maintaining your cover." The magnitude of what Morrison was proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just an investigation, it was a complete transformation of her professional identity. "Who else would know?" Elena asked. Myself, Deputy Director Sarah Chen, and a small task force at the Justice Department. Your cover would be maintained at the highest levels of classification. Elena looked out Morrison's window at the steady stream of government workers making their way between buildings. For 3 years, she had been one of them, a dedicated public servant working within the system to protect the American financial markets. What Morrison was offering was a chance to go beyond the system, to become something more dangerous and more necessary, a ghost in the machine of American capitalism. What's the timeline? She asked. Morrison gathered the papers from his desk. We would need to begin immediately. Meridian has been looking for a compliance officer with exactly your background. The position has been open for 6 weeks, which suggests they're being selective about candidates. Elena stood, her decision crystallizing as she moved. I'll need a few days to consider this. Of course. But Elena, Morrison's voice carried a note of urgency, if you decide to do this, there's no going back. Once you're inside Meridian, you'll be completely on your own. We can't protect you if your cover is blown, and we can't extract you if things go wrong. The evidence you gather will be crucial, but the personal risk is enormous. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of what she was being asked to do. As she left Morrison's office, she carried with her the knowledge that her comfortable, predictable life as a government analyst was about to end. What lay ahead was uncertainty, danger, and the chance to expose financial crimes that could reshape American markets. 3 weeks later, Dr. Elena Vasquez submitted her resignation to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Her colleagues were told she had accepted a position in the private sector, which was true enough to satisfy casual curiosity. Her personnel file was sealed and transferred to a classified archive, and her government security clearance was converted to a deep cover status that didn't officially exist. Elena spent the following month in intensive preparation. She studied Meridian's corporate structure, memorized the backgrounds of key executives, and underwent training in covert evidence-gathering techniques. She learned how to use microcameras disguised as everyday objects, how to copy computer files without leaving digital fingerprints, and how to maintain her cover identity under pressure. When Elena finally walked into Meridian's Manhattan headquarters for her job interview, she was no longer just Dr. Elena Vasquez, former SEC analyst. She was Dr. Elena Vasquez, compliance expert seeking to leverage her government experience in the lucrative private sector. The transformation was complete, and the investigation could begin. Meridian Capital Group's headquarters occupied 12 floors of a glass tower in Manhattan's financial district, with each floor representing a different aspect of the firm's operations. The trading floor buzzed with controlled chaos as dozens of analysts monitored screens displaying real-time market data from around the world. The executive floors maintained an atmosphere of quiet power, with thick carpets and oil painting suggesting both permanence and exclusivity. Elena's office was located on the 38th floor, in the Regulatory Compliance Department. It was a modest space with a window overlooking the East River, furnished with a standard desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf lined with regulatory manuals and financial law texts. What the office lacked in grandeur, it made up for in access. Compliance officers needed to interface with every department in the firm, giving Elena the perfect cover for her investigation. Her first weeks at Meridian were spent establishing her credibility and building relationships with key personnel. Elena approached this phase of her mission with the patience of someone who understood that the most valuable intelligence was often gathered through casual conversations and careful observation rather than dramatic espionage techniques. Marcus Thompson, the chief operating officer, became her primary ally within the firm. Thompson was responsible for ensuring that Meridian's operations remained efficient and compliant with regulatory requirements, which meant he worked closely with Elena on a daily basis. Elena, Thompson said during one of their weekly review meetings, I have to say, your background analysis of our international trading protocols has been exceptional. You've identified several areas where we were potentially exposed to regulatory scrutiny. Elena smiled, careful to project professional satisfaction rather than the excitement she felt at gaining access to information that would prove crucial to the federal investigation. Thank you, Marcus. I think my experience at the SEC helps me anticipate how regulators think about these issues. Exactly, Thompson agreed. That's why Harrison specifically wanted someone with your background. We need to stay ahead of the regulatory curve, especially with some of the innovative strategies our trading teams are developing. The mention of innovative strategies sent a small thrill through Elena. This was exactly the kind of information she needed to pursue. I'd love to learn more about those strategies. Part of effective compliance is understanding the business we're trying to protect. Thompson nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. I'll arrange for you to spend some time with our quantitative trading team. They're doing some fascinating work with algorithmic predictions and cross-market arbitrage. Elena maintained her professional demeanor, but internally she recognized that Thompson had just offered her access to the heart of Meridian's potentially illegal operations. The quantitative trading team would be where any market manipulation schemes would be designed and implemented. Over the following weeks, Elena embedded herself deeper into Meridian's operations. She attended strategy meetings where executives discussed client portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She reviewed trading logs that revealed patterns of coordinated buying and selling across multiple markets. And she began to document systematic evidence of securities violations that exceeded even the Federal Task Force's most pessimistic estimates. The breakthrough came during her third month at Meridian, when she was invited to observe a special client presentation in the firm's executive conference room. The presentation was being given by Dr. Robert Steinberg, Meridian's chief investment officer, a brilliant economist whose academic credentials rivaled Elena's own. Steinberg was a man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and the intense focus of someone who saw financial markets as mathematical puzzles to be solved. He stood before a wall-mounted screen displaying complex charts and graphs, addressing an audience of Meridian's most senior executives and several clients whose faces Elena didn't recognize. Ladies and gentlemen, Steinberg began, what you're seeing represents the culmination of 5 years of research into predictive market modeling. We have developed algorithms that can anticipate market movements with unprecedented accuracy. Elena sat in the back of the room, taking careful notes and trying to control her excitement. If Steinberg was claiming the ability to predict market movements, he was either making impossible promises or revealing the existence of inside information that would constitute securities fraud. The key, Steinberg continued, is understanding that market movements are not random. They are the result of decisions made by a relatively small number of institutional players. If you can predict those decisions, you can position yourself to profit from the resulting market movements. One of the clients, an elderly man with expensive jewelry and the bearing of someone accustomed to wealth, raised his hand. Dr. Steinberg, you're talking about returns that seem almost too good to be true. How can you guarantee these results? Steinberg smiled confidently. We don't guarantee anything. But our track record speaks for itself. Over the past 18 months, our algorithm-driven strategies have outperformed market benchmarks by an average of 37%. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Returns of that magnitude were mathematically impossible without either extraordinary luck or advanced knowledge of market-moving events. She was witnessing what appeared to be a presentation of a criminal conspiracy disguised as legitimate investment advice. After the presentation, Elena lingered in the conference room, ostensibly reviewing her notes but actually observing the interactions between Meridian's executives and their clients. She watched Harrison Blackwood shake hands with the elderly client, their conversation too quiet to overhear but their body language suggesting a relationship built on mutual trust and shared secrets. Victoria Sterling approached Elena as the room was clearing. What did you think of Dr. Steinberg's presentation? Elena chose her words carefully. It was impressive. The mathematical models were quite sophisticated. Sterling studied Elena's face, as if searching for some hidden meaning. Dr. Steinberg's work has been the foundation of our success over the past few years. Of course, it's important that such innovative strategies remain confidential. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Sterling was reminding Elena that discretion was expected, and that violating that trust would have consequences. Of course, Elena replied. Client confidentiality is fundamental to compliance. Sterling smiled, but her eyes remained cold. I'm glad we understand each other. As Elena returned to her office, she realized that she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just gathering evidence of potential securities violations, she was documenting an active criminal conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful figures in American finance. The stakes had just become much higher, and the danger much more real. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment reviewing the notes she had taken during the presentation. Using techniques she had learned during her federal training, she transcribed key quotes and observations into a coded format that would be meaningless to anyone without the proper decryption key. The evidence was damning, but it was also incomplete. To build a case that would withstand federal prosecution, she needed documentation of the algorithms themselves, records of specific trades that had been made using inside information, and communications between Meridian's executives and their sources of illegal information. Getting that evidence would require taking enormous risks. She would need to access computer systems beyond her authorized level, photograph confidential documents, and possibly record conversations without consent. Any of these actions could expose her cover and destroy the investigation. But as Elena looked out her apartment window at the lights of Manhattan's financial district, she knew there was no turning back. Somewhere in those towers were the architects of a fraud that was stealing billions of dollars from ordinary investors. Her mission was to expose them, regardless of the personal cost. 3 months into her assignment at Meridian, Elena had established herself as a valued member of the compliance team. Her colleagues respected her expertise, her superiors trusted her judgment, and she had access to virtually every aspect of the firm's operations. It was the perfect position for gathering intelligence, but it also made her increasingly visible to the very people she was investigating. The deeper Elena penetrated into Meridian's operations, the more extensive the criminal conspiracy appeared to be. What had initially seemed like a sophisticated securities fraud scheme was revealing itself to be something far more complex, a network of coordinated market manipulation involving multiple firms, foreign banks, and government officials across several countries. Elena's breakthrough came during a late evening when she was working alone in the compliance department, reviewing trading logs for quarterly regulatory filings. The office was nearly empty, with only the security guards and a few dedicated analysts remaining in the building. It was the perfect opportunity to access files that were normally restricted during business hours. Using credentials she had carefully acquired over the previous months, Elena accessed Meridian's central trading database. What she found there exceeded her worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. The database contained records of coordinated trades executed across multiple markets, timed to coincide with regulatory announcements, earnings releases, and other market-moving events that Meridian shouldn't have been able to predict. The pattern was sophisticated and carefully concealed. Individual trades appeared legitimate, but when analyzed collectively, they revealed a clear pattern of advanced knowledge. Elena spent hours copying files and documenting the evidence, using microcameras and encrypted storage devices to preserve the data in formats that could be used in federal court. As she worked, Elena became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside her office. She quickly closed the restricted files and opened a legitimate compliance report, but her heart was racing as she heard the footsteps approach her door. "Elena?" The voice belonged to David Chen from Human Resources. "I didn't expect to find anyone here this late." Elena looked up with what she hoped was casual surprise. "Oh, hi David. I'm just finishing up the quarterly compliance review. I wanted to get ahead of the deadline." Chen entered her office, his expression friendly but curious. "That's dedication. Most people would have gone home hours ago." "You know how it is," Elena replied. "Regulatory deadlines wait for no one." Chen nodded, but Elena noticed that his eyes were scanning her desk, taking in the documents she had been reviewing. "Well, don't work too late. The building can be a bit eerie after hours." After Chen left, Elena sat in her office for several minutes, considering the implications of the encounter. It was possible that Chen's appearance was coincidental, but in her business, there were no coincidences. Someone might be monitoring her activities, which meant she needed to be even more careful about how and when she gathered evidence. Over the following weeks, Elena developed more sophisticated techniques for accessing restricted information. She learned the schedules of cleaning crews and security guards, identified times when various departments were likely to be empty, and created legitimate reasons for being in different parts of the building outside normal business hours. Her efforts were rewarded with a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. She found email communications between Meridian executives and contacts at foreign banks discussing synchronized positioning ahead of major market events. She discovered records of payments to offshore consulting firms that appeared to exist only on paper. And she uncovered algorithmic trading programs that had been designed to exploit inside information with surgical precision. The most damning evidence came from a series of encrypted files she found on Dr. Steinberg's computer system. The files contained detailed analyses of upcoming regulatory decisions, corporate earnings reports, and government policy announcements, all dated weeks before the information became public. The source of this inside information was identified only by code names, but the financial impact was enormous. Elena realized she was documenting one of the largest securities fraud schemes in modern history. The conspiracy involved not just Meridian, but a network of firms that were collectively manipulating markets worth trillions of dollars. The evidence she was gathering would be crucial to federal prosecutors, but it also put her in extraordinary danger. The danger became real during Elena's 6th month at Meridian, when she was approached by Victoria Sterling with what appeared to be a routine assignment. "Elena," Sterling said, entering Elena's office with a thin smile, "I have a special project that requires your particular expertise. We're conducting an internal security review, and I need you to analyze our information access protocols." Elena felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of security review? "We've had some concerns about unauthorized access to confidential information." Nothing dramatic, but enough to warrant a comprehensive audit of who has access to what systems, when they access them, and what they do while they're there. The implication was clear: Meridian's executives suspected that someone was accessing information beyond their authorization level. Elena realized that her careful evidence gathering had not been as invisible as she had hoped. "Of course," Elena replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll begin the analysis immediately." Sterling's smile widened slightly. "I knew I could count on you. After all, if there is someone engaging in unauthorized activities, we need to catch them before they can do any real damage." As Sterling left her office, Elena understood that she was now being hunted by the very people she was investigating. The security review would inevitably reveal her access to restricted files, and once that happened, her cover would be blown and the investigation would be compromised. Elena had reached a critical decision point. She could withdraw from the investigation, preserving her cover but leaving the conspiracy unexposed. Or she could accelerate her evidence gathering, accepting the increased risk in order to complete her mission before being discovered. The choice was made easier by what she discovered that evening when reviewing the latest batch of trading records. Meridian's algorithms had been used to manipulate markets around a major pharmaceutical company's announcement of a breakthrough cancer treatment. The manipulation had delayed the company's stock price increase by several days, during which time Meridian and its partners had accumulated massive positions at artificially depressed prices. When the stock price finally corrected, Meridian's profits were enormous. But the delay had also meant that news of the cancer treatment breakthrough was suppressed, potentially affecting the health outcomes of patients who might have benefited from earlier access to the information. Elena realized that this wasn't just about financial crime anymore. The conspiracy was causing real harm to real people, and stopping it was worth any personal risk she might face. She made her decision. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena worked with desperate efficiency to gather the final pieces of evidence needed to complete the federal case. She photographed hundreds of documents, copied thousands of files, and recorded several conversations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The work was exhausting and terrifying. Elena knew that discovery was inevitable, but she was determined to gather enough evidence to ensure that when the federal task force moved against Meridian, their case would be airtight. The end came sooner than expected. On a Thursday morning in October, Elena arrived at her office to find Harrison Blackwood, Victoria Sterling, and David Chen waiting for her, along with two men in expensive suits whom she didn't recognize. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice carrying an ominous formality, "we need to talk." The conference room on the 47th floor had been transformed into an interrogation chamber. The usually comfortable executive meeting space now felt oppressive, with the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows creating harsh shadows across the polished mahogany table. Elena sat at one end of the table, facing 12 board members whose expressions ranged from righteous anger to calculating hostility. Harrison Blackwood had positioned himself at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a tribunal. To his right sat Victoria Sterling, her laptop open and displaying what appeared to be extensive documentation of Elena's activities. David Chen occupied a chair near the window, flanked by the two men in expensive suits whom Elena now recognized as corporate attorneys. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "we've completed our internal security review, and the results are quite disturbing. Over the past 6 months, you have systematically accessed confidential information far beyond your authorization level." Elena remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had anticipated this moment for weeks, but the reality of facing down Meridian's entire executive team was more intense than she had expected. Sterling activated her laptop's projection system, displaying a detailed log of computer access records on the wall-mounted screen. "These records show that you accessed restricted trading databases on 47 separate occasions. You downloaded proprietary algorithmic models. You copied confidential client communications." Elena studied the data being displayed, impressed despite herself by the thoroughness of Meridian's internal surveillance. They had documented virtually every aspect of her evidence gathering, though they clearly didn't understand the true purpose behind her actions. Furthermore, Sterling continued, "Our security team found unauthorized recording devices in your office, hidden cameras in conference rooms, and encrypted storage devices that violated company policy." The accusation was accurate, but Elena recognized that Sterling was presenting the evidence in a way designed to make her appear guilty of corporate espionage rather than federal investigation. The distinction was crucial, but explaining it would require revealing her true identity and compromising the ongoing federal case. Marcus Thompson, who had been one of Elena's strongest supporters during her time at Meridian, looked genuinely hurt by the revelations. "Elena, I trusted you. I gave you access to sensitive information because I believed you were here to help us maintain compliance with regulatory requirements. Was everything just a lie?" The pain in Thompson's voice was genuine, and Elena felt a pang of guilt for the deception she had been forced to maintain. Thompson was a decent man who believed he was working for a legitimate financial firm. He had no idea that his colleagues were running one of the largest securities fraud schemes in history. "Marcus," Elena said quietly, "I understand your feelings, but the situation is more complex than it appears." Blackwood slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the conference room like a gunshot. "Enough games, Ms. Vasquez. We know what you are. You're a corporate spy, probably working for one of our competitors. The question is, which one?" Elena looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. She saw fear disguised as anger, desperation masquerading as authority, and the kind of institutional arrogance that had made Meridian such a perfect target for federal investigation. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said, her voice steady despite the pressure, "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of my work here." Sterling leaned forward aggressively. "Your work here was corporate espionage, plain and simple. You systematically stole our proprietary information, violated your fiduciary duties, and betrayed the trust we placed in you." "What I find interesting," Elena replied, "is that in all of your accusations, you haven't mentioned once what I actually discovered in those files you claim I stole." A moment of silence fell over the room. Elena's response had shifted the conversation from her methods to the content of her findings, and the board members clearly hadn't expected that tactical move. "What you discovered," Blackwood said carefully, "were legitimate business strategies that you had no right to access." Elena smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Legitimate business strategies? Is that what you call coordinated market manipulation?" Is that how you describe trading on material non-public information? Is that your definition of paying offshore consulting firms for insider information? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Elena had just revealed that she knew about the conspiracy's most sensitive operations, and the board members' expressions shifted from anger to something approaching panic. Sterling recovered first, her voice taking on a sharp edge. I don't know what kind of fantasies you've constructed based on incomplete information, but these accusations are both false and slanderous. Are they? Elena asked. Then you won't mind if I share my findings with federal regulators? After all, if everything Meridian does is legitimate, a regulatory review should vindicate the firm completely. David Chin cleared his throat nervously. Elena, making threats isn't going to help your situation. We're prepared to handle this matter internally, but only if you cooperate fully with our investigation. Elena understood the subtext: cooperate and we'll let you disappear quietly, resist and we'll destroy you completely. It was exactly the kind of offer she had expected from people who believed they controlled the situation. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? Elena asked. Blackwood's expression brightened with predatory satisfaction. Simple. You tell us who you're really working for, provide us with copies of any information you've stolen, and help us assess the damage you've caused to our business relationships. In return, we'll handle this matter internally and avoid involving law enforcement. Elena studied the faces around the table, reading the mixture of desperation and arrogance that had led these people to believe they could intimidate a federal investigator into submission. And if I refuse? Sterling's smile was cold and sharp. Then we'll have no choice but to pursue criminal charges for corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and violation of fiduciary duty. You'll spend the next decade in federal prison, and your career in finance will be permanently destroyed. The threat was delivered with absolute confidence, as if Sterling believed she held all the cards. Elena almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That's an interesting offer, Elena said, standing slowly. But I'm afraid I have to decline. The board members exchanged glances of surprise and growing alarm. They had expected either capitulation or desperate denial, not calm rejection of their ultimatum. Ms. Vasquez, Blackwood said, his voice taking on a warning tone, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. We have enough evidence to destroy your life. Whatever your mysterious employer promised you, it won't be worth the consequences you're about to face. Elena moved to the windows overlooking Manhattan's financial district, her back to the board members. Mr. Blackwood, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who I work for. We know exactly who you work for, Sterling snapped. Some competitor who wanted our proprietary trading algorithms. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate or force us to destroy you. Elena turned back to face the room, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled. It was a small, enigmatic expression that somehow managed to fill the space with uncertainty. Actually, Elena said quietly, I work for the United States government. The silence that followed Elena's declaration was absolute. For several heartbeats, the only sound in the conference room was the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic 47 floors below. Then, as the implications of her words began to sink in, the board members' expressions shifted from confusion to alarm. Harrison Blackwood was the first to recover his voice. That's impossible. You resigned from the SEC. We verified your employment history. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a leather credential case. She placed it on the table and opened it to reveal a federal badge and identification card that bore her photograph alongside text that read, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Special Agent, Securities and Exchange Commission, Financial Crimes Task Force. My resignation from the SEC was part of my cover assignment, Elena explained, her voice calm and professional. For the past 8 months, I have been conducting an undercover investigation into securities fraud and market manipulation activities centered at Meridian Capital Group. Victoria Sterling stared at the credentials as if they might disappear if she looked away. This has to be fake. You can't just walk into a private company and spy on them. There are laws. There are indeed laws, Elena agreed. Federal securities laws that Meridian has been systematically violating for over 3 years. My investigation has documented extensive evidence of insider trading, market manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud investors. Marcus Thompson looked genuinely shocked. Elena, I don't understand. If you're really a federal agent, why didn't you just tell us? We would have cooperated with any legitimate investigation. The silence that followed Elena's declaration was absolute. For several heartbeats, the only sound in the conference room was the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic 47 floors below. Then, as the implications of her words began to sink in, the board members' expressions shifted from confusion to alarm. Harrison Blackwood was the first to recover his voice. That's impossible. You resigned from the SEC. We verified your employment history. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a leather credential case. She placed it on the table and opened it to reveal a federal badge and identification card that bore her photograph alongside text that read, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Special Agent, Securities and Exchange Commission, Financial Crimes Task Force. My resignation from the SEC was part of my cover assignment, Elena explained, her voice calm and professional. For the past 8 months, I have been conducting an undercover investigation into securities fraud and market manipulation activities centered at Meridian Capital Group. Victoria Sterling stared at the credentials as if they might disappear if she looked away. This has to be fake. You can't just walk into a private company and spy on them. There are laws. There are indeed laws, Elena agreed. Federal securities laws that Meridian has been systematically violating for over 3 years. My investigation has documented extensive evidence of insider trading, market manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud investors. Marcus Thompson looked genuinely shocked. Elena, I don't understand. If you're really a federal agent, why didn't you just tell us? We would have cooperated with any legitimate investigation. Elena almost felt sorry for Thompson's naivete. Marcus, the investigation couldn't succeed with cooperation because the violations were being committed by Meridian's senior leadership. The evidence I needed could only be gathered through covert means. David Chen leaned forward, his face pale. What kind of evidence? Elena opened her portfolio and withdrew a tablet computer. She activated the device and connected it to the room's projection system, replacing Sterling's access logs with her own presentation. Documentation of coordinated trading activities that violate Section 10(b) of the Securities Exchange Act, Elena began, displaying charts and graphs that showed the patterns of illegal market manipulation. Records of payments to offshore entities in exchange for material non-public information, constituting insider trading under federal law. Communications between Meridian executives and foreign contacts discussing market manipulation strategies. With each slide, the board members' expressions grew more alarmed. They were seeing their own criminal activities laid out with the precision and thoroughness of a federal prosecution. This data shows that over the past 18 months, Meridian's illegal trading activities have generated approximately $2.7 billion in illicit profits, Elena continued. The conspiracy involves not just Meridian, but a network of firms, banks, and government officials across multiple jurisdictions. Blackwood found his voice again, though it now carried a note of desperation. Even if you are who you claim to be, this evidence was gathered illegally. You violated our privacy, our corporate rights. Under federal law, Elena interrupted, law enforcement officers conducting authorized investigations have broad latitude to gather evidence of criminal activity. My assignment was approved at the highest levels of the Justice Department. Sterling stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is insane. You're talking about destroying a firm that employs thousands of people, that manages retirement funds for millions of Americans. I'm talking about stopping a criminal conspiracy that has stolen billions of dollars from those same Americans, Elena replied. The legitimate business activities of Meridian will continue under proper oversight. the criminal activities will stop. Elena advanced to the next slide, which showed a network diagram illustrating the connections between Meridian and other entities involved in the conspiracy. This investigation is part of a coordinated federal effort involving the SEC, the FBI, the Treasury Department, and international law enforcement agencies. Arrests will begin within the next 48 hours. The revelation hit the board members like a physical blow. Several of them slumped in their chairs, while others began speaking in urgent whispers to the corporate attorneys who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. Furthermore, Elena continued, any attempts to interfere with the investigation, destroy evidence, or flee the jurisdiction will be considered additional federal crimes. This conference room is currently under surveillance, and all communications have been monitored since I revealed my identity. It was a bluff, but an effective one. Elena could see the panic spreading through the group as they realized they were trapped in a situation completely beyond their control. One of the corporate attorneys, a thin man with nervous eyes, finally spoke up. Dr. Vasquez, if what you're saying is true, then our clients need legal representation. This meeting should end immediately. Elena nodded. Of course. But I should mention that cooperation with the federal investigation could significantly impact sentencing recommendations when this matter reaches federal court. Blackwood's facade of authority had completely collapsed. What do you want from us? Full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, Elena replied. Complete disclosure of all criminal activities. Assistance in identifying other participants in the conspiracy. An immediate cessation of all illegal trading activities. Elena began packing her materials, her movements unhurried and professional. Gentlemen, ladies, I should inform you that federal agents will be arriving shortly to execute search warrants for this building. I recommend that you contact your attorneys and prepare for a very lengthy legal process. As Elena moved toward the conference room door, Sterling called out desperately. Wait. If we cooperate, if we provide the information you need, what happens to us? Elena paused at the door, her hand on the handle. That will depend on the extent of your cooperation and the severity of your individual involvement in the conspiracy. But I can assure you that the federal investigation will proceed with or without your assistance. Elena left the conference room behind her in chaos, with board members frantically making phone calls and attorneys trying to establish damage control protocols. As she walked through Meridian's offices toward the elevator, she could see other employees going about their normal business, unaware that their company was about to become the center of one of the largest securities fraud prosecutions in federal history. 3 hours after Elena revealed her identity to Meridian's board of directors, the 47th floor of the Manhattan Financial Tower was transformed into a federal crime scene. FBI agents moved through the offices with professional efficiency, executing search warrants and securing evidence that would be crucial to the prosecution of what media outlets would soon label the Meridian conspiracy. Elena stood in the lobby of the building, watching as federal agents escorted several Meridian executives from the elevators. Harrison Blackwood was among them, his expensive suit wrinkled and his normally perfect hair disheveled. As he passed Elena, their eyes met briefly, and she saw something she had never seen in his expression before: complete defeat. Dr. Vasquez. The voice belonged to Director James Morrison, Elena's supervisor from the SEC. Morrison had arrived from Washington on the first available flight, bringing with him a team of federal prosecutors and forensic accountants who would be responsible for turning Elena's evidence into criminal charges. Director Morrison, Elena replied, offering him the secure briefcase that contained 8 months of investigative materials. The evidence package is complete. We have everything we need to prosecute the entire conspiracy. Morrison accepted the briefcase with the reverence of someone who understood its contents could reshape American financial markets. Elena, I want you to know that this investigation represents the finest work in the history of federal securities enforcement. Your dedication and courage have exposed criminal activities that might have continued for years. Elena nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The mission was complete, but the personal cost had been enormous. For 8 months, she had lived a lie, maintaining relationships with people she was investigating, pretending to be someone she wasn't. What happens now? Elena asked. Federal grand jury proceedings will begin within the week, Morrison replied. We'll need your testimony, of course, but the evidence you've gathered is so comprehensive that prosecutions should be straightforward. Most of the defendants will likely accept plea agreements rather than face trial. Elena looked back at the building that had been her workplace and her mission for the better part of a year. And Meridian itself? The legitimate portions of the business will continue under federal oversight, Morrison explained. Client funds will be protected, and legitimate employees will retain their positions. But the criminal enterprise is finished. As federal agents continued to stream in and out of the building, Elena noticed Marcus Thompson standing near the security desk, looking lost and confused. Despite his association with Meridian's leadership, Elena's investigation had revealed that Thompson was likely unaware of the criminal conspiracy. Elena approached him, feeling a need to explain what had transpired. Marcus, I want you to know that this wasn't personal. You were never a target of the investigation. Thompson looked at her with a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. Elena, I trusted you. I brought you into sensitive meetings, gave you access to confidential information. Was any of it real? My respect for your professionalism was real, Elena replied. My belief that you're a decent person was real. The deception was necessary to expose criminal activities that were harming millions of investors. Thompson nodded slowly, though Elena could see he was still struggling to process the revelation that his colleague had been a federal agent. What happens to people like me? People who worked here but weren't involved in whatever this conspiracy was? The federal investigation will determine individual culpability, Elena said. If you weren't involved in criminal activities, you have nothing to fear from the prosecution. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon providing briefings to federal prosecutors and assisting with the organization of evidence that would be used in the criminal trials. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than the federal task force had initially suspected, with connections to criminal organizations in multiple countries and corruption that reached into several government agencies. As evening approached, Elena finally left the federal command post that had been established in a nearby office building. She walked through the streets of Manhattan's financial district, past the towers that housed some of the world's most powerful financial institutions, reflecting on the mission that had consumed her life for the past 8 months. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Director Morrison, press conference scheduled for tomorrow morning. DOJ wants you there to discuss the investigation. Congratulations on a job well done. Elena smiled as she read the message. Tomorrow, she would stand before television cameras and explain how a routine securities investigation had uncovered one of the largest financial fraud schemes in American history. The story would make headlines around the world and serve as a warning to other financial institutions that might be tempted to violate federal securities laws. But tonight, Elena was content to walk through the city as herself, no longer hiding behind a cover identity, no longer pretending to be someone she wasn't. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Special Agent, Securities and Exchange Commission, was finally free to go home. 6 months after the federal raids on Meridian Capital Group, the largest securities fraud trial in recent American history began in the Southern District of New York. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and representatives from victim advocacy groups who had been following the case since the initial arrests. Elena sat in the witness section, wearing a conservative navy suit and carrying the same portfolio that had been her constant companion during her months undercover at Meridian. She had already provided extensive testimony to the federal grand jury, but today she would take the witness stand in open court to describe her investigation for the public record. The prosecution was being led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, a brilliant legal mind who had spent months preparing the case that would either vindicate or destroy Elena's 8 months of undercover work. Chen stood before the jury, a diverse group of 12 Americans who had been tasked with determining whether the evidence Elena had gathered was sufficient to prove criminal conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began, over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of a criminal conspiracy that stole billions of dollars from American investors. The evidence was gathered by a federal agent who risked her career and her safety to expose these crimes. Elena watched as Chen outlined the prosecution's case, describing the systematic market manipulation, the insider trading schemes, and the international network of corrupt officials who had enabled Meridian's criminal activities. The evidence was overwhelming, but Elena knew that defense attorneys would argue that her undercover investigation had violated the defendant's rights. Harrison Blackwood sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a high-priced criminal defense lawyer who had built his reputation on representing white-collar criminals. Blackwood looked older than he had during Elena's time at Meridian, his face drawn and his expensive suit unable to conceal the toll that federal prosecution had taken on his health and confidence. Victoria Sterling occupied another defendant's table, flanked by her own legal team. Sterling's auburn hair had been cut shorter, and she wore a modest business suit that projected respectability rather than the aggressive power she had displayed during Elena's undercover assignment. When Elena was called to testify, she approached the witness stand with the calm professionalism that had served her throughout her career in federal law enforcement. She was sworn in and took her seat, facing the jury that would ultimately determine whether her investigation had been conducted properly and whether the evidence she had gathered was admissible. "Dr. Vasquez," Chen began, "please tell the jury about your background and qualifications." Elena spoke clearly and confidently as she described her education, her experience at the SEC, and her specialized training in financial crimes investigation. She explained how she had been selected for the undercover assignment and the extensive preparation she had undergone before infiltrating Meridian. "When you began your assignment at Meridian Capital Group," Chen continued, "what were you hoping to discover?" "Initially, we suspected that Meridian was engaged in sophisticated insider trading," Elena replied. "Our market surveillance systems had detected trading patterns that suggested access to material non-public information." "And what did you actually discover?" Elena turned toward the jury, making eye contact with several jurors as she spoke. "I discovered a criminal conspiracy far more extensive than we had originally suspected. Meridian was at the center of an international network that was systematically manipulating financial markets through coordinated trading, insider information, and corruption of government officials." Chen guided Elena through a detailed description of her investigation, using charts and graphs to illustrate the evidence she had gathered. Elena described the trading algorithms that had been designed to exploit inside information, the payments to offshore consulting firms that existed only on paper, and the communications between Meridian executives and their criminal contacts. The defense attorneys took turns cross-examining Elena, trying to portray her investigation as entrapment and her evidence-gathering techniques as violations of their clients' constitutional rights. But Elena's testimony was precise and unshakable, supported by hundreds of documents and recordings that corroborated every aspect of her account. "Dr. Vasquez," asked Blackwood's attorney during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you deliberately deceived my client and violated his trust in order to gather evidence?" "I conducted an authorized federal investigation using lawful undercover techniques," Elena replied. "The deception was necessary because the criminal activities could only be documented from within the organization." "But you formed personal relationships with people at Meridian, didn't you? You gained their trust and then betrayed that trust for your investigation." Elena paused before answering, considering the weight of the question. "I maintained professional relationships that were necessary to complete my mission. The personal cost of those deceptions was significant, but it was justified by the criminal activities I was able to expose." The trial continued for 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of Meridian's criminal conspiracy. Elena's undercover recordings were played for the jury, revealing conversations in which Meridian executives discussed their illegal activities with casual indifference to the harm they were causing. When the defense attorneys presented their case, they argued that Meridian's activities were legitimate investment strategies that had been misinterpreted by overzealous federal prosecutors. They portrayed Elena as an ambitious agent who had manufactured evidence to advance her career. But the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. Financial experts testified about the mathematical impossibility of Meridian's returns without insider information. Former Meridian employees testified about suspicious activities they had witnessed. International law enforcement officials described the network of corrupt contacts that had enabled the conspiracy. During closing arguments, Chen stood before the jury and summarized the prosecution's case. Dr. Elena Vasquez risked everything to expose a criminal conspiracy that stole billions of dollars from American investors. The evidence she gathered is comprehensive, credible, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. The defendants are guilty of the charges against them, and justice demands that they be held accountable for their crimes. The defense attorneys argued that the government's case was based on misinterpretation and prosecutorial overreach, but their arguments rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Elena had accumulated during her months undercover. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. Harrison Blackwood was convicted of conspiracy, securities fraud, and money laundering. Victoria Sterling was found guilty of insider trading and obstruction of justice. The other defendants received similar convictions that would result in lengthy federal prison sentences. As the verdicts were read, Elena felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the personal cost of her investigation would remain with her for the rest of her career. She had exposed one of the largest financial fraud schemes in American history, but she had also deceived people who had trusted her and destroyed relationships that had felt genuine despite their foundation in deception. 2 years after the Meridian trials concluded, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before a classroom of federal law enforcement trainees at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She had been invited to speak about undercover investigations and the ethical challenges faced by agents who must live dual lives in service of justice. The classroom was filled with young agents who would soon be deployed to investigate crimes ranging from terrorism to white-collar fraud. Elena looked at their eager faces and remembered her own early days in federal law enforcement, when the mission had seemed straightforward and the moral complexities had not yet become apparent. Undercover work requires you to become someone you're not, Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the experience she was describing. You must be convincing enough to fool sophisticated criminals, but you must never lose sight of who you really are and why you're doing the work. Elena described her investigation at Meridian, explaining how she had built relationships with people she was investigating and the psychological toll that such deception could take on an agent. She emphasized the importance of having strong support systems and clear ethical guidelines when conducting long-term undercover assignments. The evidence I gathered at Meridian resulted in convictions that prevented billions of dollars in additional fraud, Elena said. But the personal cost was significant. Some of the people I deceived were themselves victims of the conspiracy, and they deserved better treatment than I was able to provide while maintaining my cover. After her presentation, Elena was approached by a young agent who asked about the moral justification for the deception required in undercover work. Agent Vasquez, the trainee asked, "How do you reconcile the harm caused by deception with the good accomplished by the investigation?" Elena considered the question carefully before responding. "You don't reconcile it. You live with it. The harm caused by deception is real and lasting, but sometimes it's necessary to prevent greater harm. The key is to never become comfortable with the deception, to always remember its cost, and to make sure that the good you accomplish justifies the harm you cause." Elena's work at Meridian had established her as one of the most successful undercover agents in federal law enforcement history. She had been promoted to senior special agent and was now responsible for training other agents in the techniques she had developed during her investigation. The Meridian case had also led to significant reforms in financial regulation and law enforcement cooperation. The international network that Elena had exposed had been dismantled through coordinated efforts by law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. New regulations had been implemented to prevent the kind of systematic market manipulation that Meridian had practiced. Harrison Blackwood had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $1 billion. Victoria Sterling received a 10-year sentence and forfeited her assets to compensate victims of the conspiracy. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, with most of their assets being liquidated to fund victim compensation. Marcus Thompson, whom Elena's investigation had cleared of criminal involvement, had found new employment with a smaller investment firm that specialized in ethical investing. He had testified for the prosecution during the trial, helping to establish the extent of the conspiracy and the methods used to conceal it from legitimate employees. Elena occasionally wondered about the people whose lives had been disrupted by her investigation. Some had been criminals who deserved prosecution, but others had been innocent employees whose careers had been destroyed by their association with Meridian. The collateral damage was an unavoidable consequence of exposing large-scale criminal conspiracies, but Elena felt responsible for every person who had suffered as a result of her work. Despite the personal cost, Elena remained committed to federal law enforcement and the mission of protecting American financial markets from criminal exploitation. Her experience at Meridian had taught her that the most dangerous criminals were often the most respectable, hiding their crimes behind facades of legitimacy and institutional authority. As Elena left the FBI Academy and drove back to Washington, she reflected on the strange journey that had taken her from a government analyst to an undercover agent to a training instructor. The work was difficult and sometimes morally ambiguous, but it was necessary. Someone had to stand between ordinary Americans and the sophisticated criminals who would steal their life savings without a moment's remorse. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Director Morrison, who was now the deputy director of the SEC. The message was brief but intriguing: new assignment available. Similar scope to Meridian. Interested? Elena smiled as she read the message. Despite everything she had endured during her undercover assignment, despite the personal cost and moral complexity, she knew her answer immediately. There were other criminals out there, other conspiracies to expose, other victims to protect. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Special Agent, Securities and Exchange Commission, was ready to disappear again. This story illustrates the courage and dedication of federal law enforcement officers who risk their careers and personal relationships to expose financial crimes that threaten American markets. While the characters and specific events are fictional, they are based on real investigations that have protected millions of investors from sophisticated fraud schemes. If you enjoyed this story of courage, justice, and the hidden heroes who protect our financial system, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of the Eighth Battery. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know about other stories of justice and resilience you'd like to hear.